Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Jonathan Oates. I am the archivist for the London Borough of Ealing, but in my spare time, I'm also a historian of crime who also enjoys some fictional crime as well. Now, there are many books about Agatha Christie's life and times. Most of them give great emphasis to important places in her lifetime. For example, Torquay, where she was born and lived as a child and young woman. They talk about Greenaway in Devon, where she later lived with her second husband. They talk about the house in Wallingford and Sunningdale. But one place I've noticed that most books by Agatha Christie do not talk about is a place where she felt was very important, and she talks about it frequently in her autobiography. But it's somewhere that most historians of Agatha Christie seem to completely neglect, which is very strange because it is also the scene of some of her stories, and there's a number of other links between Agatha Christie and this particular place. Now, you probably guessed that I am now talking about Ealing, of which I have been the London Borough of Ealing's archivist since 1999, and I've written several books on the history of Ealing, including its criminal history. But tonight we're talking about Agatha Christie and Ealing. Now, some of you may not know very much about Ealing. In fact, before I began working there over 20 years ago, the only thing I could tell anybody about Ealing is that there was an old film studios there, which is correct, it's still there, but there's a lot more to Ealing's history than that. I don't intend to bore anyone with a long dissertation on the history of Ealing. If you want that, you can read some of my books about Ealing, but I will talk a little bit about Ealing before introducing Agatha Christie and her importance in its history. Now, Ealing is now a suburb of West London, but at the end of the 19th century, and indeed in the beginning of the 20th century, it was a district in Middlesex, which is now basically North and West London. Ealing is about 6 miles to the west of the centre of London. It is situated on the Uxbridge Road, which is the main thoroughfare between Oxford Street and the town of Uxbridge, at the very edge of Greater London, or Middlesex as it was then. Ealing was known as being a middle-class town, basically, but there were substantial elements of a working class, especially in South and West Ealing. But as a middle-class town that we'll be talking about it. In Agatha Christie's early life, there were a number of interesting characters in Ealing, a couple of whom I'll mention. There was Dorothea Chambers, who was the daughter of the vicar of St Matthew's Church in Ealing, and she won Wimbledon ladies singles more times than any other player until very recent times. There's a blue plaque on the house where she used to live. The other personality, which Agatha Christie might well have heard of, was Travers Humphreys. Travers Humphreys was a barrister who later became a judge, and he was involved in many important criminal trials, such as the Brides in the Bath murderer, Joseph Smith in 1915, and also the acid bath murderer, John Haig in 1949. He lived in Ealing for many years. Another important character in Ealing's history was Charles Jones. Now, Charles Jones was the pivotal figure in Ealing history between approximately 1863 and 1913. The reason for this is that he was the council's surveyor and architect. He designed much of the infrastructure that was needed to drag Ealing from being the village it was in the 1860s to the corporate town, which it became at the beginning of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century. He laid out drainage, he laid out roads, he instituted construction of lamps, he made schools, He designed the town hall, both of them. He designed churches. He designed many of the important elements of Ealing's infrastructure. And he also wrote 2 books about it as well. Ealing was seen at the beginning of the 20th century as being a very attractive place to live. It had great open spaces, such as Walpole Park, bought by the council in 1900, Lammas Park, Ealing Common, lots of other open spaces for people to play football, cricket, or generally to relax in. It had a number of sporting, social, political, and other clubs for people to participate in their time off. It had a number of schools, both private and council schools after 1903. It had a low death rate. It had a relatively low rate to be paid by the public. So for many reasons, it was an attractive place to live. And finally, it was close to London. So you could commute into London easily, return home easily on a train or the buses. And there's also a number of negative attractions. It had no lunatic asylums, it had no magistrates' courts, it had no workhouses, and it had no pauper schools. So for many reasons, it was seen as being a good place to live. Into Ealing in 1878 came Mrs. Margaret Miller. Mrs. Margaret Miller is absolutely crucial in this story. The reason is that Margaret Miller, who was born in 1828 in Chichester as Margaret West, was the great aunt of Agatha Christie. In 1863, Margaret married Nathan Miller, who died in 1869. And equally important, Margaret's sister was called Mary. When Mary married, one of her children was called Clarissa. And Clarissa, after she married Frederick Christie, was Frederick Miller, I beg your pardon, was the mother of Agatha Christie, as we shall call her. So we have Agatha's great aunt who's living in Ealing. Between 1878 to 1880, Margaret is living at a house in Florence Terrace, which is now Ealing Mall, on the east side of Ealing, quite close to Ealing Common. However, from 1881 to 1914, she's living in a detached house at 9 Craven Gardens, which is on the Uxbridge Road. It was later known as 99 Uxbridge Road, and it had 10 rooms. Unfortunately, that house, as with most of the houses along the Uxbridge Road in that part of West Ealing, is now no more, and a rather soulless office block stands on the site, which is a great shame. Anyway, because Margaret Miller lived in Ealing, Agatha often visited her. And indeed, Agatha wrote in her biography, Ealing, however, was an excitement. It had all the romance of a foreign country. Agatha was born in 1890, and as said, her great aunt lived in Ealing from 1878 to 1914. So for approximately the first 24 years of Agatha's life, Ealing was a constant element. It seems she often visited there for long periods of time, living with her great aunt, and according to autobiography, absolutely loving it. Her aunt did not have a great establishment. She just had 2 female servants. One was a cook and one was a housemaid. But she was a very sociable lady, and she had lots of friends and neighbours who would often drop in. Among these friends and neighbours were a number of retired army officers who Agatha remembers meeting and thinking that her sense of humour was not the same as hers. It's possible, of course, that these retired army officers became the prototypes of characters who would appear in many of Agatha's later novels and short stories. You might ask why there were so many army officers in Ealing. Well, Ealing was almost a second Cheltenham at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. It seemed that a lot of retired empire builders liked to live in Ealing. You can find lots of examples of them in the directories and the census returns. Many of them took up important positions locally in the council and in church positions as well. George Orwell, in his novel Coming Up for Air, mentions that Ealing was an Anglo-Indian suburb par excellence. And another book published in the 1930s, factual book, by M.S. Briggs, Middlesex Old and New, also refers to the large number of retired army officers that lived in Ealing. So Agatha met many of these people. She also remembers being at her great aunt's house, playing cards and playing quiz games, meeting other friends of her great aunt, and generally having quite a good time there. She enjoyed her great aunt's back garden and said, in Ealing, in the garden, it is always summer. And she also admired the wonderfully large toilet in her great aunt's house. And she said that sitting on it, one felt like a queen on the throne. Now, Ealing was actually changing considerably between 1890 and 1910. In her autobiography, Agatha talks about, as a very small child, seeing the golden buttercups, which were in abundance all around St. Stephen's Church in West Ealing. But by the 1900s, all that land had been built upon. And this was because there's a population explosion in Ealing between 1891 and 1911. It increased from 23,787 people in 1891 to 61,222 people in 1911. So more than 100% rise in population. And the increase in numbers of houses was also significant. The number of houses nearly doubled. This meant that a lot of the older grand houses, such as Fordhook, where Henry Fielding once lived, were demolished in Fordhook's case in 1903, and there were a number of other houses and other major landmarks, including the Great Ealing School, which went in 1908. The Manor House was also demolished by 1910 as well. So a great deal of change was happening in Ealing at this time. However, to get back to Margaret particularly, Agatha wrote in her autobiography that Margaret was an important force in the creation of her most favourite detective character, Miss Jane Marple. In her autobiography, Agatha wrote that her great aunt was the sort of old lady would have been rather like some of my grandmother's Ealing cronies, old ladies whom I have met in so many villages where I have gone to stay as a girl. Miss Marple was not in any way a picture of my grandmother. She was far more fussy and spinsterish than my grandmother ever was. But one thing they did have in common with her, that although she was a cheerful person, she always expected the worst of everybody and everything, and was with almost frightening accuracy proved right. It seems that Margaret had great concerns about confidence tricksters, fraudulent clerks, people collecting for false charities, and so on. And she would warn her friends and neighbours about men who looked respectable enough but were actually thieves. Now, the local newspaper of the time, the Middlesex County Times, was full of articles about con men, fraudsters of the type that Margaret was concerned about. So it seems that Margaret was right to be concerned. If you remember in the Miss Marple books, there are many, many, many references to Miss Marple warning people about the fact that trust is can be a very dangerous thing. towards the end of Sleeping Murder, for instance, she tells the young couple who are the main characters in the story that a problem with you, my dears, is that you trusted people. I never have for years. And if that sounds cynical, it sounds as if it's the genuine voice of Margaret Miller. Margaret Miller was also able to check when a servant of one of her relations who was visiting was pregnant, and to suggest to her relative that the seducer be made to do the right thing and be married to the servant. But she also saw good things in people as well. On one occasion, a clergyman and a relative of Margaret's came round to visit, and Margaret said to the young woman that the clergyman was in love with her. And the woman said, no, 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 that's not true. I'm merely a friend of his, and I'm helping him get over his bad health. However, a few years later, the two did get married and apparently lived a very happy life. Now, apart from being very perceptive, Margaret Miller and Agatha Christie had one other concern which seems to be shared by a lot of people in Ealing at that time, and that was the problem of the trams. The tram issue is addressed in Agatha's autobiography, but I'll give a bit of extra detail about this, because the tram issue was the most important political stroke social issue which faced Ealing at the end of the 1890s. What it was this. The London United Electric Tramway Company wanted to build a trackway for their trams to run from Shepherd's Bush in inner London, westwards all along Acton, Ealing, Hanwell, Southall, Hayes, Hillingdon, and as far as Uxbridge. But to lay their tracks and to lay their overhead wires for the electric trams, they had to have the permission of the councils whose land they were going to build on. Most of the councils along the route were quite happy to see the trams. They thought it was a new, efficient, cheap form of transport that would greatly benefit the people who lived in their districts. But many in Ealing Council were opposed to it. The Conservatives on the council, who had the majority, were basically against the trams, and the Liberals, often called the Progressives, who tended to speak for working classes, were basically pro-tram, as was the editorial of the Middlesex County Times newspaper. And there were lots and lots of letters about the tram, both pro and anti, in the press. Agatha, in her autobiography, spends some time talking about the trams, and I will cite this. The trams came to Ealing, and local opinion erupted in fury. A terrible thing to happen to Ealing, such a fine residential neighbourhood, such wide streets, such beautiful houses, to have trams clanging up and down. The word progress was uttered, but howled down. Everyone wrote to the press, the MP, to anyone they could think of to write to. Trams were common, they were noisy. Everyone's health would suffer. There was an excellent service of brilliant red buses with Ealing on them in large letters, which ran from Ealing Broadway to Shepherd's Bush, and another extremely useful bus, although more humble in appearance, which ran from Hanwell to Acton. And there were the good old-fashioned Great Western Railway, to say nothing of a district railway. Trams were simply not needed, but they came, and there was weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, the trams were launched in Ealing in the summer of 1901, basically because of the campaign in Ealing for trams. The council eventually conceded permission for the tramway company, but not before gaining considerable concessions to the council's advantage. The trams helped to make Ealing a more attractive place to live for those with lower incomes, because trams were very frequent and very cheap, and a lot faster and cheaper than trains, and in many cases more convenient as well, because they went on the main road rather than the railway, which wasn't always as convenient for everybody. Now, I've talked about the trams a lot, and the other reason why trams were important to Agatha was, according to her autobiography, her first published work concerned the trams. In her autobiography, she cites the first verse of this poem, which she wrote, and it read, "When the first electric trams did run, in all their scarlet glory, 'twas well, but ere the day was done, it was another story." Unfortunately, a number of researchers, including myself, have looked through the local newspapers, both the Middlesex County Times and the more new newspaper of the time, the Ealing Gazette. But unfortunately, no one, as far as I'm aware, has been able to find Agatha's poem, which is a great shame, because if we had that, we would know her first work that was ever published, and that must have been around about 1901, when the trams were first introduced into Ealing. So if anyone can find this, this would be hugely beneficial. Anyway, we'll now move on. Agatha, as said, enjoyed her time in Ealing immensely. She enjoyed going to the theatre with her great aunt, and she also apparently read newspapers to her great aunt as well. Now, newspapers at the beginning of the 20th century had far more detail than they do now. Print was very small, there were very few pictures, and so therefore crimes, especially murders, and especially murder trials, were reported in great detail, almost verbatim, with lots about the witnesses, the judge, the jury, the accused, and so forth. And I'm sure that Agatha learned a lot about real life crime by reading accounts in newspapers. And even local newspapers had what we would call national news in them as well. So, for example, in 1888, which I know is slightly before Agatha Christie's life, the Ealing newspapers had material about Jack the Ripper, even though this was a crime which took place in Whitechapel in East London rather than Ealing, which was to the west of London proper. Now, as far as crimes went in Ealing at this time, there were very few. There was a murder in 1893 by a father of his daughter, and then in 1910, 17 years later, when there was another murder in Ealing, that of Annie Covell, whose throat was slit in a house in Florence Terrace, not far, of course, from where Margaret used to live. And she was killed by Alfred Perry, who was her fiancé, and he was hanged. In 1912, there's another Ealing murder when Arthur Benbow shot dead his landlady, Sophia Baker, in Kingsley Avenue, and he was found to be mentally deranged and sent to Broadmoor for the rest of his life. Apart from crime, Ealing has some other important connections with Agatha. First of all, her father died in Margaret's house in 1907. Now, Agatha's father was a very amiable man. He was very popular. People who knew him, Agatha had a great fondness for him. But unfortunately, he didn't have any qualifications or experience that would suit him for business or work of any kind that would pay him money. In 1907, he'd come to Ealing to try and find work in London. But unfortunately, he fell ill and died. And Agatha talks about his death and the fact that she was not able to attend the funeral. Her father was buried in Ealing Cemetery, which is on South Ealing Road, and I'm glad to say that there is a plaque outside the cemetery entrance which lists famous people who are buried in Ealing Cemetery. It mentions both of Agatha's parents and Agatha's great aunt, who you could argue weren't famous for themselves. They were famous in having a very important crime writer as their relative. But even so, in 1919, when Margaret Miller died, albeit in Torquay, where she had moved in 1914, she was buried in the same grave. And subsequently, in 1926, when Agatha's mother died, she was also buried in the same plot. So Agatha's father, mother, and great aunt are all buried in Ealing Cemetery in the same grave. And it's quite a substantial grave. It has all their names on. And the board at the front of the gate of the cemetery does give you clues of how to find this important grave. So that's a very important link with Ealing and Agatha. Unfortunately, the local newspapers don't seem to have reported the funeral of any of these three individuals, probably because Agatha's parents never actually lived in Ealing, and so therefore there would be little local interest or knowledge about them. And her great aunt had died in Ealing, had lived in Ealing for many years, but had died in Torquay in 1919, 5 years after leaving Ealing, so therefore would not have been terribly well known in 1919. Ealing is also important in Agatha's story because it is mentioned, or in some cases, districts surrounding Ealing are mentioned in several of her books. The first one to mention a locality which is nearby is the book The Big Four, which was published in 1927 and is not usually regarded as one of Agatha's great works by any stretch of the imagination. But from our point of view, it's important because of Hanwell Asylum being mentioned and a man allegedly from the asylum turning up at Poirot's flat. Now, Hanwell Asylum, as might be thought, might be in the district of Hanwell, which is just to the west of Ealing. But actually, it's a reference to the Middlesex County Asylum, which is in the district of Southall, which is just to the west of Hanwell. And the reason it's called Hanwell is that when it was established in 1829, the nearest settlement in terms of built-up areas was Hanwell. The actual village of Southall was somewhat off from the asylum itself. And certainly by 1927, it was normally called St. Bernard's Mental Hospital, not an asylum. But anyway, in the book The Big Four, a man turns up at Poirot's flat claiming to be a keeper, not an attendant, from the asylum, and he's in search of a man, a patient at the asylum who's escaped. It turns out that the patient is actually hiding in Poirot's flat, and the attendant manages to decoy Poirot and Hastings away, and eventually the alleged keeper turns out to be an assassin, one of the deadly four in the Big Four. He kills the patient, who's actually a secret agent, and it's certainly not Poirot's or the author's finest hour. But there's other references as well in the Agatha Christie canon. In the collection of short stories, also published in the 1920s, titled Poirot Investigates, which is the first collection of Poirot short stories, all of which feature Captain Hastings, and most have been televised. One story is titled The Adventure of Hunter's Lodge. Readers of the story might remember that a revolver wrapped in paper is found in Haven Green, Ealing, and is taken by the finder to Ealing Police Station, which was then on Ealing High Street. And it turns out that the pistol was put there as a red herring by the murderer. Now, Haven Green is that stretch of land, about 7 acres worth, which is just opposite Ealing Broadway Station. It's clear that the man who found the revolver was probably a commuter travelling to the railway station for work and was walking across Haven Green when he finds the revolver and turns it in. There's another reference to Ealing, again in the 1920s, in The Secret of Chimneys, where our hero is looking through a telephone directory for a lady by the name of Revell. One of the people he finds is a Miss Revell who lives in Ealing, but he's not the woman he seeks, and that's that. Another story which features Ealing is the wartime story published in 1940, titled 1-2 Buckle My Shoe. In that story, Poirot goes to Ealing as part of his investigation. He alights at Ealing Broadway station. He surely must then cross Haven Green, although it's not mentioned by name, because he needs to speak to a gentleman who lives in 88 Castle Gardens, Ealing. Now, there is no Castle Gardens, Ealing as an address, but there is a Castle Bar Road, Ealing, and a Castle Bar Hill, Ealing. And Castle Bar Road is surely what Agatha means, and surely where Poirot goes to. He goes to the house to speak to a retired civil servant who turns out to be a retired secret agent who's able to give Poirot useful information. Poirot admires the man's neatly designed garden as well. The other story, which has local references, is 450 from Paddington, a Miss Marple novel of the 1950s. Miss Marple takes the train, 450 from Paddington, naturally, in search of her investigation, and en route she passes by 2 railway stations, which are corruptions of actual stations. One of the stations is called Hailing Common, which is surely meant to be Ealing Common. The other station is Barwell Heath, which is undoubtedly meant to be Hanwell, and Hanwell used to have Heath. It is, however, puzzling that Miss Marple can only see 3rd-class passengers leaving at Hailing Common and Barwell Heath. I'd have thought in the 1950s that there would have been some 1st and 2nd-class passengers, at least at Hailing Common. But there we are. There's also a couple of other books which have tangential references to Ealing. For instance, At Towards Zero, a novel in which there is a psychopathic tennis player. This story may be slightly inspired by a real-life murder which took place in Ealing in 1936, when a tennis player kills his best friend. And there was another real-life murder in the 1950s in Ealing, when a retired naval officer created what he thought was a perfect alibi, just the type of alibi that you might expect in an Agatha Christie book. And in this case, the gentleman was Lieutenant Commander Ronald Chesney, who fortunately his alibi was cracked and he was brought to a kind of justice, albeit at his own hand by suicide. It's interesting to note that there's a number of Agatha Christie connections with Ealing as regards the dramatisations of her work, which most of you will be familiar with. David Suchet, who's perhaps seen as the best impersonator of Hercule Poirot on the screen, has connections with Ealing. In 1976 to 1977, he lived in Southall, which is in the Borough of Ealing. In 1978 to 1980, he lived in Broomfield Place, West Ealing. And then from 1981 to 1986, he lived in a house in 28 Creswick Road, Acton, which again is in the London Borough of Ealing. And it's in this time, when he was living in Acton, that he had his first brush with an Agatha Christie adaptation, because he played Chief Inspector James Japp in the TV movie 13 at Dinner, an adaptation of Lord Edgware Dies, opposite Hercule Poirot, played by Peter Ustinov. It may come as a surprise to some people who are used to Suchet as Poirot to see that Suchet is playing Inspector Japp as a clean-shaven man. David Suchet has said that his role in 13 at Dinner is probably one of his worst performances of all time, but it's not too bad. As a coincidence, in Creswick Road in Acton, several decades before David Suchet lived there, a young lady called Muriel Eady lived there, and regrettably, she was the victim of serial killer John Christie in 1944. Apart from David Suchet, there was also Philip Jackson, who played Chief Inspector James Japp in the Poirot series, and he lives in Hanwell, which is, as I've said, adjacent to Ealing. The final cinematic connection between Agatha Christie and Ealing is the fact that the Hoover building, which is an Art Deco factory, which is located on the Western Avenue in Perry Vale, which is in the north of the Borough of Ealing, featured prominently in the first series that David Suchet made of Agatha Christie's Poirot, broadcast in 1989. In the episode titled The Dream, which is loosely based on the short story of the same name, which appeared in Poirot's early cases, much of the action in that drama is set in or outside the factory, which is central to the plot, and that factory is the Art Deco Hoover building. So next time you watch The Dream, you will see one of Ealing's architectural gems on the screen, which is very appropriate for lots of reasons. Finally, just one more connection. If you look at the 1911 census, which you can see on ancestry.co.uk, you can see in number 9 Craven Gardens, apart from Margaret Miller and her 2 servants, you will also see the name Agatha Miller, her great niece, as being resident in Ealing on the census night of 1911, which is a great way to help to show how Ealing and Agatha go together hand in hand. Now, I may well have talked for far too long on this show, but I will probably, if I ever give this talk live, I will probably talk longer. I'll probably cite Agatha's autobiography far more. I will probably give more information about the social history of Ealing between 1890 and 1914, at a time when Ealing, according to Charles Jones, the surveyor who I've mentioned, was known as Queen of the Suburbs. Perhaps the talk could be called The Queen of the Suburbs Meets the Queen of Crime. Thank you and good night.